All right, everybody can see lecture 12, yeah?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, we are moving on now from the emphasis on social and cultural history that I presented to you in the last two lectures. That was the lecture on gentility and the lecture on women and children in the early republic. And now we are looking at how the United States kind of comported itself in the first decade under the Constitution. And spoiler alert, I mean, the whole point of this lecture is to convey to you that the United States was a weak power in the 1790s and that it found itself kind of struggling between two major powers, France and Great Britain, that were at war with each other. The fact that France and Britain were at war with each other, and the fact that within the United States, some people supported France and some people supported Britain, meant that foreign policy had a huge impact on domestic policy. I'll just repeat that last part. We're going to see how the American government is split between supporters of France and supporters of Britain. And because Britain and France are at war with each other, the United States is having to respond to those pressures, and it impacts domestic policy. Oh, I should say this is the USS Constitution. This is one of the ships that was built in the 1790s in order to deal with the fact that we were in a sort of a war with France, a quasi-war as it's called. It was not a declared conflict, but certainly they were preying on American shipping. And so there was a huge naval building program that involved building ships like the USS Constitution. Have any of you ever seen the USS Constitution in person?
No.
It is docked in Boston Harbor. You can tour it if you're ever there. And they take it out for a spin once a year around July 4th. Probably not during COVID times, but other times. So it's pretty cool. All right, this right here is a picture, a painting called "Oh, the Roast Beef of Old England" or Calais Gate. It shows France, and it shows somebody walking along with a giant roast beef, and French people who are very skinny, who are starving and looking very greedily and hopefully at this roast beef that they're never going to get. This is a painting that dates from that time period of tension between Britain and France that is going to be the centerpiece of what I'm talking about today.
I have a question.
Sure.
So this time that that Britain and France are at war, what is the time frame of this again? What year?
They start to go to war in 1793. They finish the conflict in 1815. There is a 2-year hiatus in the war between 1800 and 1802. But other than that, they're fighting for all that time. And that is because the French Revolution involved the French trying to expand past their nation's borders and also killing a bunch of aristocrats and their king and queen. And so the British, went to war with them over both of these things. So yeah, it's a really prolonged conflict, as we're going to see, and ends with the defeat of Napoleon finally in 1815. All right. So George Washington becomes the first president under the new Constitution. He inherited from the Articles of Confederation government a really small government. For example, the Foreign Office had John Jay and 2 clerks. The Treasury Board had really no money in it. Most of the Army had been disbanded, so there were only about 670 people in the Army at that point. There was no Navy. There were about a dozen clerks who had served the old Congress. There was a heavy debt. And Washington was also, in addition to having this government that was really like too small to answer to his needs, also was under the realization that everything he did set a precedent for the future. Even the question of what the new president should be called plagued Congress. When they were talking about the presidency, one committee suggested, "His Highness, the President of the United States and Protector of Rights of the Same," which I'm glad that they kind of backed off on that one and decided on President of the United States. I told you about his high pay, the fact that he held formal levees twice a week or once a week, just like the monarchs of European countries, and that he drove around in a carriage with retainers in livery. Formal dinners were held at the presidential mansion in New York. The presidential mansion had 7 enslaved workers working there who ran the mansion for Washington. But despite the fact that Americans had a president with a good public image that could match that of almost any European monarch, America was a tiny and inconsequential country at this point. Now, Washington selected a cabinet that included people of differing views. He thought the best thing for the running of the United States, for the executive branch, would not to be to have a bunch of yes men who would always agree with everything that Washington said, but rather to have people who were going to really have a healthy debate with each other. Alexander Hamilton became Washington's Treasury Secretary. As you know, if you've seen Hamilton the musical on the Disney Plus channel, or listened to the soundtrack, or actually seen it in person, he was of unknown parentage. He was born on a Caribbean island, left an orphan while in his early teens. With the help of friends, he made it to New York, where he was educated at Columbia University. He joined the Army, became a protege of George Washington, fought in the Revolutionary War, and then later became a lawyer. Okay, it is important for you to know that Alexander Hamilton had a set of preferences and positions that I've listed here. First of all, he was an Anglophile. He was pro-Britain. And in the wartime conflict, as we're going to see between Britain and France, he is going to back the British side. He was also pro-manufacturing. Like Britain was a country that had begun to undergo an industrial revolution in this period, Hamilton thought the best thing for the nascent United States would be to have factories and industry. And not only that, in order to have enough workers for factories and industry, it was important to keep Americans kind of hemmed in on the East Coast so that they would be available to do this work. So he was anti-Western expansion. He also was pro-government centralization and was especially concerned that the United States should have a good financial sector, just like Great Britain. So he wanted there to be a public debt, that is, for the United States federal government to assume the debts of the individual states. The individual states had become indebted during the Revolutionary War. Hamilton wanted the government to take on these debts, to sell bonds to investors so that the debts would be paid off and the investors would get interest. And also that the national debt would give people a reason to believe in the federal government, a reason to support the existence of the federal government. It was something that would sort of tie together all the various states. He also wanted a national bank. Slowly under his program, the American currency began to gain some of its former value. The economy began to recover. Remember, I talked about how in the 1780s we were running into some economic hard times. But Hamilton also kind of ignored the fact that other people disagreed with him. He didn't really listen very well to others. The group of people who followed him in his pro-manufacturing, pro-Britain, anti-expansion, pro-government centralization party were known as the Federalists. Okay. Any questions about Alexander Hamilton or the Federalists? Let me check the chat. Was it the South that got mad for that? Yeah, it was basically Southern states that were not happy about the idea of manufacturing for reasons that we're going to see later, but I'll spoiler alert, tariffs have something to do with it. If you're going to protect nascent American industry, you're going to want to put a tariff to make manufacturing from other countries more expensive for American consumers. And this is always bad for Southern farmers. So yeah. Okay, I can see the chat now. Any other questions? Thomas Jefferson, in contrast, was Washington's Secretary of State. And Jefferson came from a completely different background. He was 12 years older than Hamilton. He was born into the Virginia aristocracy. He was a real Renaissance man. He knew a lot of things. He was very interested in science. But he feared the development of capitalism. And he envisioned the United States as an agrarian republic, as a republic made up of farmers, as a country made up of people who would be able to be self-sufficient because they could grow things and didn't have to rely on manufacturing. As a result of this, he really wanted expansion. That, you know, westward expansion was necessary if you wanted to have enough land for everyone to have a farm. Jefferson also was in favor of power being reserved for the states. Like other anti-federalists, he feared aggregations of power in the central government. He was sure that if a central government were too strong, that people's rights would get taken away. And this set of views became affiliated with or associated with a new political party called the Democratic Republicans. So you have on the one hand the Federalists and on the other hand the Democratic Republicans. Any questions? This is one of the places where Hamilton the musical is actually pretty good about the two sides. So I just want to share with you one song from that before we move on to the next slide of the lecture. So let me attempt to do that. Oh, hang on a sec. Okay.
You could have been anywhere in the world tonight, but you're here with us in New York City. Are you ready for a cabinet meeting, huh? The issue on the table. Secretary Hamilton's plan to assume state debt and establish a national bank. Secretary Jefferson, you have the floor, sir.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We fought for these ideals, we shouldn't settle for less. These are wise words, enterprising men quote them. Don't act surprised, you guys, cause I wrote them. Ow, what Hamilton forgets. His plan would have the government assume state debts. Now place your bets as to who that benefits. The very seat of government where Hamilton sits.
Not true.
Oh, if the shoe fits, wear it. If New York's in debt, why should Virginia bear it? Our debts are paid, I'm afraid. Don't tax the South, cause we got it made in the shade. In Virginia, we plant seeds in the ground. We create. You just wanna move our money around. This financial plan is an outrageous demand, and it's too many damn pages for any man to understand. Stand with me in the land of the free. Pray to God we never see Hamilton's candidacy. Look, when Britain taxed our tea, we got frisky. Imagine what gon' happen when you try to tax our whiskey.
Thank you, Secretary Jefferson. Secretary Hamilton, your response. Thomas, that was a real nice declaration. Welcome to the present, we're running a real nation. Would you like to join us? Or stay mellow, doing whatever the hell it is you do in Monticello? If we assume the debts the union gets, a new line of credit, a financial diuretic, how do you not get it? If we're aggressive and competitive, the union gets a boost, you'd rather give it a sedative? A civics lesson from a slaver. Hey neighbor, your debts are paid cause you don't pay for labor. We plant seeds in the South, we create, they keep ranting. We know who's really doing the planting. And another thing, Mr. Age of Enlightenment, don't lecture me about the war, you didn't fight in it. You think I'm frightened of you, man? We almost died in the trench. Well, you were off getting high with the French. Thomas Jefferson always hesitant with the president. Medicine, there isn't a plan he doesn't jettison. Madison, you mad as a hat, so taking medicine. Damn, you in worse shape than the national debt is in. Sitting there useless as two shits. Hey, turn around, bend over, I'll show you where my shoe fits. Excuse me. Madison, Jefferson, take a walk. Hamilton, take a walk. We're gonna reconvene after a brief recess. Hamilton, sir, a word.
You don't have the votes.
You don't have the votes. You're gonna need congressional approval, and you don't have the votes. Such a blunder, sometimes it makes me wonder why I even bring the thunder.
Why he even brings the thunder?
You wanna pull yourself together? I'm sorry, these Virginians are birds of a feather. Young man, I'm from Virginia, so watch your mouth. So we let Congress get held hostage by the South? You need the votes. No, we need bold strokes. We need this plan. No, you need to convince more folks. Well, James Madison won't talk to me. That's a non-starter. Winning was easy, young man. Governing's hard. They're being intransigent. You have to find a compromise. But they don't have a plan. They just hate mine. Convince them otherwise. And what happens if I don't get congressional approval? I imagine they'll call for your removal. Sir, figure it out, Alexander. That's an order from your commander.
Okay, so as you can see, or as you now know, the cabinet battle is based on a real conflict within the cabinet over whether or not Alexander Hamilton's financial plans were going to be put into play. Let me go back to the PowerPoint. Okay. The French Revolution began in 1789, and as you guys will remember, the United States had signed a treaty, well, really two treaties, a Treaty of Amity and Commerce and a military treaty in 1778. Most Americans were happy at the beginning of the French Revolution. They welcomed the fall of the French monarchy. Americans were not, super keen on monarchy at this point. After Parisians stormed their famous prison, the Bastille, located in Paris, they actually sent the key to the Bastille to George Washington as a symbol of their respect for him. But after a few years, the French Revolution turned bloody. There was lots of infighting among various factions. It didn't really have any kind of thematic through line in terms of what it was trying to accomplish. And the execution of Louis XVI was followed by war between Britain and France for 22 years. The question became, Did the United States have a responsibility to join the side of France in this war? Because theoretically, that Treaty of Alliance had never been abrogated. It had never been stopped. And so theoretically, we ought to support France. But what ends up happening is that Washington declares neutrality. I have on here the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Just like we wrote a Declaration of Independence for this country, the French produced their own declaration at the beginning of their revolution in 1789. And it was kind of similar to the American Declaration, but did guarantee more property rights. One of the things that happened, the United States became the first country in the world to recognize the non-royal government of France. And the French sent an ambassador, citizen Edmond Charles Genet, to the United States. So this is kind of a normal proceeding that we would take an ambassador from a country that we recognize. But when war broke out, citizen Genet started to give out licenses to American ship owners to be pirates against the British. There's this thing called privateering. It's kind of like legal piracy in wartime. You're given a letter that establishes that you're doing this for a government, that you're privateering for a government. And Washington was extremely unhappy that Ambassador Genet was trying to get Americans embroiled in this war on the side of France. Ordinary Americans had a mixed reaction. There were people who were Anglophiles like Hamilton, and they were kind of scared about what was happening with the French Revolution, feared that there would be similar kinds of bloody uprisings in the United States. On the other side, people who were not Federalists, people who were Democratic Republicans, set up democratic societies to lobby for the French cause. Ultimately, there was a lot of changing of personnel in the French Revolution, and the faction that Citizen Genet represented was thrown out of power. So if he had tried to go back to Paris, he would have had his head cut off at the guillotine. So he decided to stay in the United States. He married the governor of New York's daughter, and he died an American citizen. The French Revolution divided Americans into supporters of France, and the supporters of France considered themselves, beacons of liberty, supporters of reason. The people who were anti the French Revolution considered themselves the sort of tribunes of order and religious faith. It didn't seem at the time that you could be both things simultaneously. Okay, questions so far? There were other issues that came up with other powers. So there were conflicts over the navigation of the Mississippi River. For farmers who were living in the backcountry, in the area close to the Mississippi, the Mississippi River had been shut off to American navigation by the Spanish. The Spanish at this point owned the colony of Louisiana. You can see that on the map. Americans could not use the port of New Orleans. They could not ship their grain. And so it was really hard for Americans on the frontier to make a living. The Spanish also were preventing Americans moving westward by importing large numbers of French Canadians into the southernmost part of Louisiana Territory. These French-speaking settlers were known as Acadians or Cajuns. And the idea here was that, ultimately the United States couldn't move westward into Louisiana because it was already occupied by people who represented a different European power. Western farmers the only thing they could really do with their excess grain, since they couldn't sell it, they couldn't navigate the Mississippi to sell it through the port of New Orleans, was to make whiskey out of it. And whiskey made in backyard stills was subject after 1794 to an excise tax. The people who lived on the frontier were very unhappy about the excise tax, and just as it happened during the American Revolution with the Stamp Act tax collectors, they attacked the excisemen who were trying to collect taxes on the whiskey. In 1794, in the summer, Western Pennsylvanians tried to raid Pittsburgh, and they were, picking up their pitchforks and torches and muskets to march on Pittsburgh because they were angry about the whiskey tax. Washington responded to this so-called whiskey rebellion by sending in federal troops that he led. It was something like 10,000 federal troops that he was at the front of. The ringleaders of the whiskey rebellion were tried for treason but never executed. So one of the questions that the whiskey rebellion raised for people was, okay, well, when this new constitutional government does things that people disagree with, do they have a right to rebel? That was one of the questions. And another was, what is the relationship of the Western frontier to the central government? Finally, there were clashes along the northern border, the border of the United States with Canada. The English were still hanging out in the forts right at the northernmost extent of American territory or in disputed territory, and they were supplying arms and supplies, other supplies, to native tribes that were then using them to attack American settlers. So all of this was causing conflict. And the question became, what could the United States, a kind of meek power with no army and really not any navy and not a lot of respect in the world, what could we do about it? Questions so far? This is a still. Well, it's a little tiny model of a still that somebody might have used to make their whiskey with. A couple of treaties were signed that alleviated some of the tension. One was a very popular treaty, one was a very unpopular treaty. In 1794, John Jay, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, was sent to Britain to negotiate a treaty. He, among other things, he was supposed to get the British out of our northern forts and western forts and to legalize American trade with the West Indies, with the British Caribbean islands, and also to get compensation for slaves who had been freed during the Revolutionary War. But he was unable to achieve any of these things. There was so much tension in Washington's cabinet that people who were pro-British had already told the British, this is all the things that Jay can offer you, and you would be better placed to just not agree with him on anything. So the treaty that was signed was not very beneficial to the Americans. There was no reparations for the enslaved people being freed. The British promised to withdraw from American soil, but they actually didn't do it. And when Jay got back with his treaty, he said he could see his way to his house through the streets of London by the light of his own burning effigies. That is, people made like paper mache John Jay dolls and set them on fire in the streets as part of their demonstrations against the Jay Treaty. Pinckney's treaty, in contrast, was much more popular. It was negotiated with Spain, and Spain agreed to open the Mississippi to American shipping, and including access to the port of New Orleans. So Western settlement could now really continue much more easily. Farmers had ways to ship their goods down the Mississippi River. And the problem of the West was kind of like kicked down the road temporarily. Questions? Washington served 2 terms of office. There was nothing in the Constitution limiting him to 2 terms of office, but that was about all that he felt like doing. He felt as though the example of the leaders of, ancient Greece and Rome was you serve a couple of terms in leadership positions, and then you go back to your farm and you go back to your family. And so in 1796, he gave a farewell address, which set out the boundaries of how the United States was going to behave in the world, or try to behave in the world, until the 1820s. The farewell address called for 2 things. First of all, it called for the United States to adopt a policy of isolationism. That, just like Thomas Paine said in Common Sense, we should take advantage of the fact that we are a continent distanced from Europe by the Atlantic Ocean. We shouldn't get involved in European problems. We don't want anything to do with European wars. We don't want to sign any alliances that are going to commit us to intervening on behalf of European powers. So isolationism was one of the 2 things. The other was he warned about nascent political parties. He warned about faction, which is what political parties were called at that time. He really did not think that factions or cliques or political parties were good for the Republic. And whatever you think about that, it was certainly something that Washington warned about. As soon as the Americans had made their position on England known via Jay's Treaty, the French started to make war on American shipping. See, we signed a treaty with the English and the French are at war. The French react by going to war against us. Makes sense, right? They were confiscating American cargoes. And the response to this, I should say that after Washington was in office, the next president was John Adams. The response by President Adams was to send somebody to negotiate with the French. When the envoy, the American envoy, got to France, the French said they wanted a bribe. There were 5 commissioners, 5 directors then heading the government. They wanted $250,000 each for a personal bribe, and the nation of France wanted a loan for $12 million from the American government if they were going to try to negotiate an end to this undeclared war. The American envoy was really mad that they were asking for a bribe. He replied to the French directorate, "Not a 6pence." But history has put into his mouth through mythology, a much more poetic speech. "Millions for defense, but not a cent for tribute." He wrote back to the government in Washington explaining what had happened, but he changed the names of the people that he was negotiating with to just the letters X, Y, and Z. And this demand for a bribe on the part of the French has been called the XYZ affair. There followed for 3 years a quasi-war with France, mostly the French ships picking on American ships, but at the same time, we were undertaking a large naval building program. The French were aided in their war on American shipping by some states at the northern tip of Africa, the Barbary states. The Barbary pirates were operating out of Algeria. And so the US government undertook this naval building program where one of the ships that they built was the USS Constitution, known as Old Ironsides because it was so stoutly built that cannonballs would bounce right off it. I'm going to tell you one little other side story. During this quasi-war with France, there was a Quaker from Pennsylvania by the name of George Logan. And Logan, being a Quaker, didn't like war. So he decided to go to France and try to negotiate as a private citizen with the French. He really didn't get anywhere with the government of France, but while he was gone, Congress passed an act that is still on the books, the Logan Act of 1799, that makes it illegal for a private citizen to negotiate with foreign governments without official permission. You will have heard, if you were paying attention to the news during the last year, of people saying, oh, Rudy Giuliani, he offended against the Logan Act, or maybe he should be prosecuted under the Logan Act. Nobody has successfully been prosecuted under the Logan Act, but it dates all the way back to this quasi-war with France. Okay. Well, John Adams was a Federalist. So like Hamilton, he was pro-British, anti-French. So, you know, saw the French as American enemies. And his policies during his term of office, which lasted from early 1797 to early 1801, included cracking down on French people in America. Two pieces of legislation were passed, the Alien Act and the Sedition Act. The Alien Act made it so that the President of the United States and the executive branch could deport aliens who were thought to be enemies to the United States. The Sedition Act limited the freedom of speech of people to talk about the government in negative ways. If you gave any criticism of the government or its leading officers or any attempt to get together to criticize the government or its officers, you could be criminally liable, you could be imprisoned, you could be fined. The Sedition Act was used mostly against Democratic Republican newspapers. So the Sedition Act was used more as a political weapon against the enemies of the sort of political enemies of John Adams than it was against anybody who was a threat to the United States. What do you think might be the problem with an act that makes it illegal to criticize the government?
It goes against the First Amendment.
Right. At this time, though, the Supreme Court really hadn't sort of taken on upon itself the responsibility for judging laws unconstitutional. So what happened was state legislatures said, hey, we're not going to obey these acts. We see these acts as unconstitutional, and therefore we are not bound by them. Virginia and Kentucky were the states that resolved not to follow these acts. They passed the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, and they said, look, the Constitution is really just nothing more than a compact between states. The states are really sovereign. And if states don't like a piece of legislation that the federal government passes, they can nullify that legislation. Nullification is a very important concept. It is going to come up 2 more times before the Civil War, so 2 more times in this class. Therefore, really know what the doctrine of nullification is. Okay. Questions?
Is that nullification kind of the same understanding as like states legalizing marijuana nowadays?
Yeah, federalism, to not talking about here the party of John Adams and Madison, etc. But the idea of federalism is the idea that there are different responsibilities that are split between the state governments and the federal government. And states really are supposed to be regulating things like health, education, welfare, that sort of stuff. And the states that have passed legislation allowing for either medical or recreational marijuana use are doing that under their constitutional responsibility for ensuring health, or, you know, like for health, education, welfare, morals, that sort of thing. Simultaneously, the United States government has decided that these things are illegal, but has not really been enforcing those laws at the state level. So we're in this kind of uneasy federalist kind of balance between the feds and the state government on this issue. It is also the case that quarantines by state governors in the face of a pandemic are also one of these issues that, you know, are granted to the states to do this sort of thing under the concept of federalism. So the United States government couldn't say, oh, we're going to make it, you know, we're going to say states cannot put quarantines or cannot regulate what businesses are opened and closed in a pandemic, sort of thing. Other questions? The Hamiltonian-Jeffersonian split in foreign affairs gives rise to a party system. This is the first party system. The first party system is the Federalists on the centralization side versus the Democratic Republicans on the non-centralization side. So this is how we get political parties. We get them through Americans responding to the pressure of foreign governments. In the election of 1800, it was unknown whether there was going to be able to be a peaceful transition of power. But of course, there was a peaceful transition of power. What ended up being weird about the election was that how the presidential election worked in this time period. The person with the most votes became president. The person with the second most votes became vice president. Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, his opponent, were both Democratic Republicans. When they had the election of 1800, nobody got a majority of electoral votes in the election process. What happens when there is no electoral vote majority? Nobody knows?
Does it go to the Supreme Court?
No, even though that's sort of what happened in Bush v. Gore in 2000. No, if there's a tie, and this could happen, so everybody should know this, it goes to the House of Representatives and they vote by state delegation. So every state has one vote. That means that in the House of Representatives, you know, if there's an electoral tie, a state like Wyoming or Alaska has one vote and a state like California has one vote. There was no electoral majority in the Thomas Jefferson versus Aaron Burr presidential contest. So people didn't know who was going to be the president, who was going to be the vice president. The House of Representatives convened and voted to choose the president, but they stalemated. They had 35 ballots, all of which were tied. They had 35 votes. and couldn't choose a president. Finally, on the 36th vote, somebody abstained. Thomas Jefferson became the president. Aaron Burr became the vice president. There was a peaceful transition of power. Thomas Jefferson came to power, and one of the first things that he said in his inaugural speech was, "We are all Republicans. We are all Democrats." I mean, we are all Federalists. We are all Democratic Republicans. So saying, you know, party lines are not important. We are all Americans. Also, after that happened, the 12th Amendment was passed, which gave a different mode of choosing the vice president. It wasn't the person who then had the second most votes. My conclusion here is that we can't really understand how parties get started in America without understanding America's role in the world as a country that was just really trying to keep its head above water in the midst of a conflict between the two global powers of the time, Britain and France. So make sure that you know who are the Democratic Republicans, who are the Federalists, what side is Jefferson on, what side is Hamilton on, who's in favor of Britain, who's in favor of France. These are important things to know.